Sorry, we can't include you in the family photo, my mother said casually, adjusting my sister's perfectly curled hair while I stood there in my bridesmaid dress makeup, done holding the bouquet I'd spent hours arranging. 26 years of family gatherings, and suddenly I wasn't family enough for their precious portrait. But as I stepped back watching them pose without me, I noticed something that made my blood freeze. The way my father's hand trembled, the guilty glance between my parents, the inheritance papers peeking from my sister's purse. Hey, beautiful souls. Before we dive into this absolutely wild family drama, drop a comment and tell me where you're watching from. And if you're ready for a story that'll make your jaw drop about family betrayal and the sweetest revenge ever served, smash that like button and hit subscribe because you won't believe how this ends. Trust me, this family photo drama is just the beginning of something much bigger. The wedding reception continued around me like nothing happened, but something fundamental had shifted. I'm Serafina, and I've always been the responsible daughter, the one who took care of our ailing grandmother while my sister Brianna partied through college, the one who managed the family bakery's books when Dad's arthritis made it too painful to write, the one who never asked for anything in return, because family was supposed to be everything. But standing there excluded from what should have been a celebration of our family unity, I felt something crack inside my chest. Not just hurt, though God knows there was plenty of that, but a cold analytical clarity that I'd never experienced before. I watched my parents laughing with Brianna's new husband, Marcus, a charming investment banker who'd swept into our small Wisconsin town 6 months ago with promises of expanding Dad's bakery into a regional chain. They were discussing business plans, throwing around numbers that seemed impossibly large for our little family operation. Something about market expansion, franchise opportunities, and investor meetings that I'd somehow never been included in. The inheritance papers. I couldn't stop thinking about them. Why would Brianna have inheritance documents at her own wedding? Our grandmother had passed 3 months ago, leaving behind the bakery, the family house, and what we'd always assumed was a modest savings account. The will reading had been postponed indefinitely due to paperwork complications that our family lawyer, Mr. Henderson, kept being vague about. I slipped away from the reception, my heels clicking against the marble floor of the hotel lobby as I made my way to the quiet business center. My phone buzzed with a text from my college roommate, Jessica, who worked in estate law in Milwaukee. "How was the will reading? Did you guys get everything sorted with your grandmother's estate?" That text hit me like a physical blow. Jessica had been asking about the will for weeks, confused about why it was taking so long. She'd mentioned that most estate settlements, especially for middle-class families, were straightforward affairs that rarely took more than a month to resolve. I called Mr. Henderson's office, knowing he'd be closed, but hoping to leave a voicemail requesting a meeting. Instead, his answering service informed me that his office had been handling our family's affairs per the primary beneficiary's instructions, and that all communications were to go through Miss Brianna Sullivan and her designated financial advisor. Primary beneficiary. Since when was Brianna the primary? Anything Grandma Rose had always treated us equally, had always promised that everything would be split fairly between her 2 granddaughters. My hands shook as I Googled Inheritance Fraud Wisconsin on the Business Center computer. What I found made my stomach drop. Stories of family members manipulating elderly relatives, forging documents, exploiting power of attorney arrangements. The symptoms were all there. Rushed paperwork, excluded family members, sudden lifestyle changes, mysterious delays in will readings. I thought back to the last few months of Grandma's life. Brianna had suddenly become incredibly attentive, visiting daily, handling Grandma's medications, managing her appointments. I'd been grateful at the time, assuming my sister had finally grown up and was taking responsibility. But now those daily visits took on a sinister tone. And Marcus. His sudden appearance in our lives coincided perfectly with Grandma's decline. an investment banker with expertise in estate planning who'd somehow convinced our traditional conservative grandmother to modernize her financial arrangements. I remembered him mentioning offshore accounts tax optimization strategies, things that seemed far too complex for Grandma's simple estate. I pulled up the county clerk's website and searched for recent property transfers. There it was, dated just 2 weeks after Grandma's funeral, a transfer of the bakery and family home from Rose Sullivan's estate to Brianna Sullivan and Marcus Thompson, with a note about prearranged beneficiary designations per updated will documentation. The business center's printer hummed as I printed everything I could find. Property transfers, business license changes, even a new LLC registration for Sullivan Artisan Holdings, with Marcus listed as the primary officer and Brianna as co-owner. They'd been planning this for months. My phone buzzed again. This time it was a Facebook notification. Someone had tagged me in a photo from the wedding, but when I opened it, I realized I'd been cropped out. In the original shot, I was standing right next to Brianna, but now it showed just her and Marcus with my parents, all of them beaming like they'd won the lottery, because they had. They'd stolen my inheritance, my grandmother's legacy, and apparently my place in the family photos, too. I sat in that quiet business center until nearly midnight, piecing together a puzzle that painted my family in an entirely new light. The excluded inheritance, the mysterious business meetings I'd never been invited to, the way conversations stopped when I entered rooms, the sudden financial improvements in everyone's lives except mine. But the most devastating realization came when I found a social media post from 3 months ago. A photo of Brianna and Marcus at some upscale restaurant celebrating what the caption called new business ventures and family partnerships. The date stamp showed it was posted the day after Grandma's funeral, while I was still crying myself to sleep, and they were apparently toasting their successful heist. I'd been played. Not just excluded, completely manipulated and betrayed by the people I'd trusted most in the world. They'd let me grieve for my grandmother while they celebrated stealing everything she'd worked for. They'd let me believe I was still part of this family while systematically cutting me out of everything that mattered. As I gathered my printed evidence and prepared to leave, one final detail caught my attention. On Marcus's LinkedIn profile, which I'd never thought to check before his employment history showed something interesting. His previous job wasn't at a prestigious investment firm like he'd told us. It was at a company that had been investigated for elder financial abuse. The company had been shut down by federal regulators just months before he'd shown up in our town. This wasn't just garden variety family greed. This was a calculated professional con job, and my sister had either been his willing accomplice or his next victim. Either way, I was done being the naive, trusting daughter who always assumed the best about everyone. Walking back to my car in the empty hotel parking lot, still in my bridesmaid dress, I felt something I'd never experienced before, the cold, sharp edge of absolute certainty. They thought they'd won. They thought I'd just accept being pushed out, fade quietly into the background like a good little victim. They were about to learn how wrong they could be. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop, a pot of coffee, and a growing stack of printed documents, planning the most important campaign of my life. If Marcus was a professional con artist and my family had been complicit in stealing my inheritance, then I needed to approach this like the business problem it actually was. First step, documentation. I'd spent 3 years getting my business degree while working at the bakery, and those research skills were about to pay off in ways I'd never imagined. I started with the basics, pulling every public record I could find about Marcus Thompson, Brianna's new husband, who'd somehow convinced my entire family to trust him with their financial futures. What I discovered was even worse than I'd suspected. Marcus had a pattern. Over the past 5 years, he'd moved through 3 different small towns, always targeting older business owners with family operations, always arriving with impressive credentials and promises of expansion, always leaving behind financial ruin and broken families. The man my sister had married was essentially a serial inheritance thief, but this time he'd made a crucial mistake. He'd targeted someone who had a granddaughter who actually understood business law and had access to the internet. I found court documents from his previous schemes. In Iowa, he'd convinced a farmer to sign over his land for a development opportunity that never materialized. In Minnesota, he'd helped an elderly widow reorganize her assets before disappearing with her entire life savings. Each time the pattern was the same charm, the family identify the weakest or greediest links, manipulate them into betraying the others, then disappear with whatever he could legally steal. The Minnesota case was particularly revealing because it had gone to trial. Marcus had been charged with elder financial abuse, but the charges had been dropped when his victim died before she could testify. However, the preliminary court documents were still public record, and they contained something invaluable: the testimony of a forensic accountant who traced Marcus's methods. According to the expert witness, Marcus specialized in creating complex financial instruments that appeared legitimate but were actually designed to transfer assets away from intended beneficiaries. He used shell companies, backdated documents, and forged powers of attorney to make his thefts appear legal. The accountant had even identified specific red flags: sudden changes to long-standing wills, the introduction of offshore accounts, and the systematic exclusion of certain family members from financial discussions. Every single red flag applied to our situation. I called in sick to my job at the local credit union where I'd been working since college. I told them it was a family emergency, which wasn't technically a lie. Then I drove to Milwaukee to meet with Jessica, my law school friend who specialized in estate fraud cases. Jessica's office was in one of those gleaming downtown towers that made our small-town bakery seem quaint by comparison. But when I spread my evidence across her conference table, her expression shifted from polite interest to genuine alarm. "Serafina," she said after reviewing everything, "this isn't just inheritance theft. This is organized fraud on a multi-state level. The FBI has task forces dedicated to exactly this kind of scheme." She explained that what I'd uncovered was part of a growing trend of financial predators who targeted small family businesses in rural communities. These operations were sophisticated, often involving forged documents, identity theft, and money laundering. The fact that Marcus had done this before meant we had a pattern of criminal behavior that federal authorities would definitely be interested in. But Jessica also delivered some hard truths. Even if we could prove everything, getting the assets back would take years of litigation. Marcus had been careful to make his thefts technically legal through manipulated documentation. And there was another problem: my family's complicity. "Your parents and sister signed documents," Jessica explained gently. "Even if they were manipulated, even if Marcus forged some paperwork, they still participated in excluding you from your inheritance. A court might rule that they're liable for damages, which means they could lose everything trying to compensate you." That hit me harder than I expected. Despite everything they'd done, the thought of destroying my parents financially made me feel sick. They were approaching retirement age, had worked their entire lives to build the bakery, had trusted the wrong person, but had they really deserved to lose everything? Then I remembered the family photo. The casual cruelty of excluding me not just from the inheritance, but from the basic acknowledgement of my existence in their lives. The way they'd laughed and celebrated while I stood there in my bridesmaid dress, suddenly understanding that I was no longer considered family. "What are my options?" I asked. Jessica outlined 3 possible approaches. The first was criminal report Marcus to the FBI and let federal prosecutors handle it. This would likely result in his arrest, but might not recover the stolen assets. The second was civil sue everyone involved for fraud and conspiracy. This would be expensive, time-consuming, and would definitely destroy what remained of my family relationships. The third option was what Jessica called strategic pressure. gather enough evidence to prove the fraud, then use that leverage to negotiate a settlement that recovered my inheritance without necessarily sending anyone to prison. It was riskier because it relied on Marcus and my family choosing to do the right thing when confronted with evidence. But it offered the possibility of recovering my grandmother's legacy without completely destroying everyone involved. I chose the third option, but with a twist that Jessica didn't see coming. I want to document everything, I told her. Every conversation, every meeting, every attempt to recover what was stolen. I want a complete record of how this family responds when faced with evidence of what they've done. Jessica looked confused. For legal purposes, no, I said, thinking about all those Reddit stories I'd read about family betrayal and justice. For personal reasons, I need to know who these people really are when they think no one's watching. And I want them to know that their actions have consequences. I was going to give my family a chance to do the right thing. But I was also going to create a complete record of whether they took that chance or doubled down on their betrayal. Because at the end of this process, I wanted to know exactly who deserved my forgiveness and who deserved to face the full consequences of their choices. The drive back to our small town felt different. I wasn't the naive, trusting daughter anymore. I was a woman with a plan, armed with evidence and backed by legal expertise. Marcus thought he'd found another easy mark in our family. My parents and sister thought they could cut me out and I'd just quietly disappear. They were all about to discover that excluding me from that family photo was the biggest mistake they'd ever made. The next morning, I started what I privately called Operation Family Truth. Armed with Jessica's legal guidance and my own growing understanding of Marcus's criminal history, I began systematically documenting everything while appearing to go about my normal life. My first stop was the bakery, where I'd worked part-time since high school. Walking through those familiar doors felt surreal now that I knew my family had stolen my inheritance, but I needed to maintain appearances while I gathered information. Dad was behind the counter kneading dough with the methodical rhythm I'd watched my entire life. For a moment, seeing his familiar figure in his flour-dusted apron, I felt a pang of doubt. This was the man who'd taught me to braid challah bread, who'd stayed up all night when I had pneumonia as a kid, who'd cried at my college graduation because he was so proud. But then I noticed the new equipment. Industrial mixers that cost thousands of dollars a professional display case that definitely hadn't been in the budget 6 months ago, and renovation work that should have been impossible on our modest bakery income. "Morning, sweetheart," Dad said without looking up from his dough. "How was the wedding cleanup?" I forced a smile. "Fine. The new equipment looks amazing. Business must be really good." Dad's hands stilled for just a moment. "Oh, Marcus has been helping us optimize our operations. Smart boy, that one. Really knows his numbers." "That's wonderful. I'd love to understand more about the business plan. Maybe I could help with the bookkeeping like I used to." The change in Dad's demeanor was immediate and telling. His shoulders tensed, and he suddenly became very focused on his kneading. "Actually, Marcus has been handling all that. Says we need more sophisticated systems now that we're expanding. Professional level stuff. Translation systems that excluded me entirely." I spent the morning helping with the usual bakery tasks while carefully observing everything. New supplier contracts were pinned to the bulletin board, all signed by Marcus as operations manager, a title that had never existed before his arrival. The cash register had been replaced with a sophisticated point-of-sale system that required passwords I didn't have. Even the petty cash box, which I'd managed for years, was now locked in a new safe that only Marcus and Brianna apparently had access to. My family had essentially erased me from the business while I'd been focused on grieving Grandma and planning Brianna's wedding. That afternoon, I drove to the nursing home where Grandma had spent her last months. I'd visited regularly, but now I needed to talk to the staff with different questions in mind. Mrs. Patterson, the head nurse, remembered me well. Serafina, how lovely to see you. I was so sorry about your grandmother. She talked about you constantly, always bragging about how proud she was of your business degree. Thank you. I was actually hoping to ask about her final months. Did she seem confused at all about her finances or legal affairs? Mrs. Patterson's expression grew cautious. Well, it's normal for elderly patients to worry about their affairs. Why do you ask? I explained carefully, without making direct accusations, that there seemed to be some confusion about Grandma's final wishes. Mrs. Patterson listened with growing concern, occasionally nodding in a way that suggested my questions weren't entirely surprising. I probably shouldn't say this, she finally admitted, but your grandmother did seem distressed about some paperwork in her final weeks. She kept asking to see you, specifically said there were things she needed to explain about her will, but your sister said you were too busy with work to visit as often. My heart stopped. Brianna told you I was too busy. She said you'd asked her to handle your grandmother's legal needs because you were overwhelmed with your job. Your grandmother seemed disappointed, but she accepted it. She signed some documents with that nice young man, Marcus, I think, because Brianna assured her it was what you'd recommended. I felt physically sick. Grandma had wanted to see me, had tried to explain something about her will, but Brianna had lied to both of us. She'd told Grandma I was too busy while telling me that Grandma was sleeping more and didn't want visitors. Is there anything else you remember? I asked, my voice barely steady. Mrs. Patterson hesitated, then leaned closer. This might be nothing, but I walked past your grandmother's room one afternoon and heard raised voices. Your sister and that young man were having some kind of argument. I heard Brianna say something like, "She's not going to understand anyway, and this way everyone benefits." When they saw me, they stopped talking immediately. I thanked Mrs. Patterson and left my hands shaking so badly I could barely start my car. It wasn't just theft. It wasn't just manipulation. They deliberately isolated my dying grandmother from the granddaughter she'd wanted to see, then used her confusion and trust to steal everything she'd worked for. The betrayal was so complete, so calculated, that I sat in the nursing home parking lot and cried until I couldn't breathe. But then my phone rang. It was Jessica calling with an update that changed everything. Serafina. I've been digging deeper into Marcus's background, and I found something big. He's not working alone. There's a network of people doing this. Lawyers, accountants, even some healthcare workers who identify vulnerable targets. The Minnesota case I mentioned. The prosecutor there has been building a federal case, and they're very interested in talking to you. She continued. There's more. I contacted a forensic accountant who specializes in inheritance fraud. She's willing to do a preliminary analysis of your grandmother's estate for free because she thinks this case could be part of a larger pattern they're investigating. If we can prove systematic fraud, you might be able to get everything back and more. I wiped my eyes and felt that cold clarity returning. What do I need to do? Keep documenting everything, but be careful. If Marcus realizes you're investigating him, he might accelerate his timeline or try to destroy evidence. Also, I need you to think about whether you want to give your family a chance to make this right voluntarily or whether you want to go straight to law enforcement. That question haunted me for the rest of the day. As I drove around our small town past the high school where Brianna and I had been crowned homecoming queens in consecutive years, past the church where our family had attended services every Sunday for decades, past the cemetery where Grandma was buried under a headstone that probably should have said betrayed by her own family, I realized that my decision would define not just my future, but who I was as a person. I could be merciful, give them a chance to confess, and make restitution preserve what remained of our family bonds. Or I could be thorough, document their choices when faced with the opportunity to do right and let the consequences of their actions speak for themselves. By evening, I'd made my decision. I was going to give them one chance. Not because they deserved it, but because I needed to know who they really were when faced with the truth. I needed to know if there was any part of the family I'd loved that was worth saving. But I was also going to document everything. Every conversation, every excuse, every attempt to justify what they'd done. Because I had a feeling that when this was over, I was going to need a complete record of exactly how my family chose to respond when confronted with evidence of their betrayal. The next phase of Operation Family Truth was about to begin, and this time I wouldn't be the naive victim they'd been counting on. I scheduled a family dinner for the following Sunday, telling everyone I had something important to discuss about Grandma's estate. The irony wasn't lost on me. I was using the same manipulative tactics they'd employed, gathering everyone under false pretenses to reveal uncomfortable truths. Marcus and Brianna arrived at my parents' house looking like the picture of newlywed bliss. Marcus carried a bottle of expensive wine that probably cost more than I made in a week at the credit union, and Brianna wore a designer dress I'd never seen before. The money they'd stolen was already transforming their lifestyle in visible ways. Mom had prepared Grandma's famous pot roast recipe, another layer of irony that made my chest tight. We were eating food made from our dead grandmother's recipe while discussing how they'd robbed her estate. "So, what's this about, sweetheart?" Dad asked as we settled around the dining room table where I'd done homework as a child, where we'd celebrated birthdays and holidays, where I'd announced my college acceptance letter with tears of joy. I pulled out a folder thick with documents, printouts, legal papers, financial records, everything Jessica and I had compiled over the past week. The weight of it felt significant in my hands. "I've been looking into some discrepancies with Grandma's estate," I said calmly, watching their faces. "And I've discovered some things that I think we need to discuss as a family." Marcus's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Brianna's hand fluttered to her throat. Mom and Dad exchanged a glance that confirmed they knew exactly what was coming. "What kind of discrepancies?" Marcus asked, his voice carefully neutral, but his eyes sharp and calculating. I could see him assessing the situation, trying to determine how much I knew and how much damage control he'd need to do. I opened the folder and spread the first set of documents across the table. Well, for starters, I found it interesting that Grandma's will was changed 3 times in her final month of life. Each version gave Brianna progressively more control over the estate until the final version essentially cut me out entirely. Brianna's face went white. "Serafina, I can explain." "I'm sure you can," I interrupted gently. "I'm also curious about Sullivan Artisan Holdings, the LLC that Marcus registered 2 weeks after Grandma's funeral, the one that now owns the bakery, the house, and all of Grandma's investment accounts." Dad's fork clattered against his plate. "How did you—" "Public records, Dad? Amazing what you can find when you actually look." I pulled out the next set of documents. I also found Marcus's employment history particularly fascinating. Did you all know that his previous company was shut down by federal regulators for elder financial abuse? The silence that followed was deafening. Marcus had gone very still, like a predator deciding whether to attack or flee. Brianna looked like she might vomit. Mom was staring at her plate as if it contained the answers to the universe. "There's more." I continued, my voice remaining steady despite the adrenaline coursing through my veins. "I spoke with Mrs. Patterson at the nursing home. She told me that Grandma specifically asked to see me in her final weeks, that she seemed distressed about legal paperwork and wanted to explain something about her will. But apparently Brianna told both Grandma and the staff that I was too busy to visit." Brianna's composure finally cracked. "Serafina, you don't understand. Grandma was confused. She was saying things that didn't make sense. Marcus was trying to help organize her affairs before she died and couldn't contradict the forged documents," I asked. "Because that's what these are, aren't they? Marcus forged powers of attorney, backdated will changes manipulated financial transfers. The same pattern you used in Iowa and Minnesota." Marcus finally spoke, his charming facade completely gone. I don't know what you think you found, but I found enough to interest the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, I said quietly. In fact, I'm meeting with Agent Sarah Morrison tomorrow morning. She's been investigating a multi-state inheritance fraud ring, and apparently my family's situation fits their profile perfectly. The effect was immediate and devastating. Marcus pushed back from the table so violently his chair nearly toppled. Brianna started crying, not gentle tears, but the ugly, desperate sobbing of someone whose world was collapsing. Dad buried his face in his hands. Mom just sat there frozen in shock. "You called the FBI," Mom whispered. "On your own family. On criminals who stole my inheritance and manipulated my dying grandmother," I corrected. "The fact that they happen to be related to me doesn't make it less of a crime." Marcus was already reaching for his phone, probably calculating how quickly he could transfer assets or flee the state. But I wasn't done. "Oh, Marcus, I should mention that Agent Morrison already has warrants to freeze all accounts associated with Sullivan Artisan Holdings. Amazing how cooperative federal judges are when you present them with evidence of organized fraud." The lie came easily, which surprised me. I'd never been good at deception, but apparently betrayal was an excellent teacher. The truth was that I hadn't contacted the FBI yet. That meeting was scheduled for tomorrow, but Marcus didn't know that. His phone clattered to the table, his face gray with panic. "You have no idea what you've done," he snarled. "This was supposed to benefit everyone. Your grandmother's estate would have been tied up in probate for years. This way your family gets to keep the business running, gets to preserve her legacy." "By stealing it?" I asked. "By forging her signature on documents that cut out one of her granddaughters? By lying to a dying woman about why her granddaughter couldn't visit her? She was going to leave everything to some cat charity anyway." Brianna exploded suddenly. Grandma was obsessed with those stupid animal rescue organizations. She was going to give away everything our family worked for to feed stray cats. Marcus helped us save the family business. The admission hung in the air like a confession. Even if there had been some truth to what Brianna claimed about Grandma's charitable inclinations, it didn't justify fraud. It didn't excuse the manipulation, the forged documents, the systematic exclusion of family members. But more than that, Brianna's outburst revealed the ugly truth. Underneath all the rationalization, this hadn't been about preserving Grandma's legacy or protecting the family business. It had been about greed, pure and simple. They'd decided they deserved Grandma's money more than her actual wishes deserved respect. "So you all knew?" I said, looking around the table. "You all knew that Grandma's will was being changed without her understanding that I was being cut out, that Marcus was stealing from our family. And you were okay with it as long as you got your share." None of them could meet my eyes. I gathered my documents and stood up, my legs somehow steady despite everything that had just happened. "I want you all to understand something very clearly. This ends tomorrow. Either you voluntarily transfer everything back to Grandma's original estate plan and Marcus turns himself in to authorities, or I give everything I've found to the FBI and let federal prosecutors sort it out." "And if we do what you want?" Dad asked quietly. I looked at him. This man who taught me right from wrong, who'd raised me to believe that family loyalty was sacred, who just sat silently while I detailed how his family had robbed his dead mother's estate. "Then maybe we can figure out if there's anything left of this family worth saving." I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat in my small apartment staring at my phone and waiting for the inevitable calls. They came in waves, starting around midnight and continuing until dawn. First was Brianna sobbing hysterically and begging me to reconsider. "Please, Sarah, you're going to destroy everything. Marcus says if the FBI gets involved, everyone could go to prison. Mom and Dad could lose the house. Is that really what you want?" The use of my childhood nickname felt like another manipulation, but I let her talk. I needed to document everything needed to understand exactly who my family became when their backs were against the wall. What I want, I told her, is for our dead grandmother's wishes to be respected. What I want is for the money that was supposed to help me buy a house, start a business, maybe have a family of my own to be returned. What I want is for people who claim to love me to act like it. But we do love you, Brianna protested. This was never about not loving you. It was about being practical. Grandma's money could help the whole family if we used it wisely instead of just splitting it up. Whose decision was that to make? I asked. Yours, Marcus's. Since when do you get to decide what's practical about other people's money? Brianna had no answer for that. The call ended with her threatening to never speak to me again if I went through with meeting the FBI. The next call was from Marcus, and it was entirely different in tone. Gone was any pretense of family warmth or reasonable explanation. This was the voice of a professional criminal who'd been caught and was calculating his options. "You think you're very smart, don't you?" he said without preamble. "But you have no idea how complicated this is. If you pursue this, I'll make sure everyone knows that you were in on it from the beginning. I have documents with your signature conversations I recorded where you agreed to the estate restructuring." I'd never agreed to any estate restructuring, had never signed any documents related to Grandma's will, but the threat was clear. He was prepared to forge evidence that would implicate me in the fraud. "Do whatever you want, Marcus," I said. "I have faith that the truth will come out." "The truth?" He laughed, a sound like breaking glass. "The truth is that your family is going to hate you forever for destroying their lives over money. The truth is that you're about to lose everyone you've ever loved for a pile of cash that won't buy you a new family." After he hung up, I sat in the dark and wondered if he was right. Was I destroying my family for money? Was there some way to recover from this that didn't involve federal prosecutors and criminal charges? But then I remembered the nursing home. Remembered Mrs. Patterson telling me about Grandma asking for me while Brianna lied to keep us apart. I remembered the wedding photo, the casual cruelty of being excluded, not just from the inheritance, but from the basic acknowledgement of my existence. I remembered the forged documents, the manipulated will, the systematic theft of everything Grandma had worked to leave behind. This wasn't about money. This was about who got to decide what happened to our family's legacy and whether the people I trusted most in the world valued me enough to include me in that decision. My parents called together just before sunrise, both of them on speakerphone, both of them crying. "Sweetheart," Mom said, her voice thick with tears. "We never wanted it to happen this way. We thought Marcus said you'd understand eventually, that you'd see how this was better for everyone." "How was stealing my inheritance better for me?" I asked. "Because you've always been so independent," Dad said. "You have your degree, your job, your whole life ahead of you. Brianna needed the security, needed help getting established. The bakery needed capital improvements to survive. We thought you wouldn't mind as much." The casual assumption that my needs mattered less than everyone else's was breathtaking in its cruelty. They'd convinced themselves that because I was competent and self-sufficient, I somehow deserved less consideration than my sister, who'd never worked a real job in her life. "And you didn't think to ask me about this," I said. "You didn't think I deserved a voice in decisions about my own grandmother's estate?" "Marcus said legal complications would make it too confusing," Mom said weakly. "He said it was better to handle everything quietly and then explain later," Marcus said. Every justification, every rationalization, every excuse led back to the professional con artist who'd identified my family as easy marks and played them perfectly. But the most devastating call came just before I had to leave for my FBI meeting. It was from Jessica, my lawyer friend, and her voice was grim. "Serafina." I have bad news. I ran a credit check on your social security number as part of our preparation, and there are some accounts that were opened in your name without your knowledge. Credit cards, business loans, even what looks like a mortgage application. Someone has been using your identity for months. My blood went cold. Marcus. Almost certainly. And there's more. The forensic accountant I mentioned. She did a preliminary review of what you sent her, and the theft is worse than we thought. Your grandmother's estate was worth almost $400,000. The house, the business, her investments. Marcus has been systematically liquidating everything and moving the money offshore. $400,000. Nearly $500,000 that was supposed to be split between Brianna and me. That would have changed my entire life. That would have let me buy a house, start a business, maybe even start a family without worrying about money. There's something else, Jessica continued. The Minnesota prosecutor I mentioned. She thinks Marcus might have poisoned his previous victim. The woman who died before she could testify, her death was attributed to natural causes, but there were some anomalies in her medical records that suggest possible poisoning. I had to sit down. The room was spinning and I couldn't breathe properly. Are you saying he might have hurt Grandma? I'm saying we need to get you to the FBI immediately, and we need to make sure you're safe. If Marcus realizes how much evidence you have, if he thinks you're going to destroy his entire operation. She didn't need to finish the sentence. I was no longer just dealing with family betrayal and inheritance theft. I was potentially dealing with a murderer who'd spent months in my family's home, who'd had access to my dying grandmother, who knew where I lived and worked. I grabbed my evidence folder and headed for the door. The FBI meeting couldn't come soon enough. 6 months later, I stood in the courthouse lobby reading the headline on my phone, Multi-State Inheritance Fraud Ring Dismantled. Federal prosecutors secure convictions in elder abuse case. Marcus Thompson had been sentenced to 12 years in federal prison. 3 of his accomplices, including a corrupt probate lawyer, received similar sentences. The FBI had recovered nearly $2 million stolen from elderly victims across 5 states. My grandmother's estate had been fully restored. Every dollar, every piece of property, every investment account. All of it returned according to her original will. But more than that, the investigation had revealed that Grandma had actually been updating her will to include a trust fund for my future children and a scholarship fund for business students at the local community college. She'd been planning to leave behind something that would help people for generations. The money was life-changing, but it wasn't the most important thing I'd gained. Agent Morrison approached me in the lobby, her expression warm with satisfaction. Ms. Sullivan, I wanted to thank you personally one more time. Your decision to come forward probably saved lives. We found evidence that Marcus was escalating his methods. Your grandmother's medical records showed traces of medication that could have contributed to her confusion in her final weeks. The implication hung heavy between us. Grandma might not have died naturally. The autopsy had been inconclusive, but there were enough questions that Marcus had been charged with elder abuse and potentially manslaughter. Even if we couldn't prove murder, we'd proven systematic poisoning designed to make her more malleable to manipulation. How are you doing with everything? Agent Morrison asked gently. I know this has been incredibly difficult. That was an understatement. The FBI investigation had torn apart everything I thought I knew about my family. Brianna had been charged as an accomplice, though she'd received probation in exchange for her cooperation. My parents had avoided criminal charges but faced civil liability for their participation in the fraud. The bakery was in bankruptcy proceedings, and I hadn't spoken to any of them since the night of our family dinner 6 months ago. Some days are harder than others, I admitted, but I'm learning that family isn't just about blood relations. That was perhaps the most important lesson from this entire nightmare. While I'd been fighting to recover my inheritance, I'd also been building a new kind of family, one based on choice rather than obligation. Jessica had become more than my lawyer. She'd become one of my closest friends. The forensic accountant, Dr. Martinez, had offered me a position at her firm, recognizing skills I didn't know I had. Agent Morrison had connected me with other victims of similar schemes, creating a support network of people who understood exactly what it felt like to be betrayed by the people you trusted most. But the most unexpected friendship had come from Mrs. Patterson at the nursing home. She'd retired shortly after Grandma's death, but we'd stayed in touch. It turned out she'd been suspicious of Marcus from the beginning, but hadn't known how to voice her concerns without seeming paranoid. "Your grandmother talked about you constantly," Mrs. Patterson had told me over coffee last week. "She was so proud of your business degree, so excited about your future. She used to say you had the strength to rebuild anything that got torn down." Grandma had been right about that. I'd used part of the inheritance to start my own forensic accounting practice, specializing in elder financial abuse cases, working with Dr. Martinez. I'd helped recover millions of dollars for other families who'd been victimized by schemes similar to what Marcus had done to us. The work was emotionally challenging, but deeply satisfying. Every case I solved, every family I helped, felt like honoring Grandma's memory in a way that simply inheriting her money never could have. My phone buzzed with a text from Brianna. She'd been trying to contact me regularly since her sentencing, wanting to rebuild our relationship. Her messages usually followed the same pattern: apologies, explanations about how Marcus had manipulated her requests for forgiveness, promises that she'd changed. Today's message was different. "Saw the news about Marcus's sentencing. I know I don't deserve forgiveness, but I'm proud of what you've built from all this. Grandma would be proud too." For the first time in 6 months, one of Brianna's messages didn't make me angry. It just made me sad. Sad for the sister I'd lost, sad for the family that had chosen greed over love, sad for all the holidays and milestones we'd never share again. But I wasn't ready for forgiveness yet. Maybe someday, but not today. I walked out of the courthouse into the bright afternoon sunshine. My new life was waiting. A successful business built on helping others, friendships based on mutual respect rather than family obligation, a future built on my own choices rather than inherited expectations. The irony wasn't lost on me that losing my family had taught me what family really meant. True family doesn't steal from you. True family doesn't exclude you from photos. True family doesn't manipulate dying relatives to change their wills. True family chooses to include you, to support you, to stand by you even when it's difficult. I'd found that true family in unexpected places with people who'd chosen to care about me rather than people who were obligated to by blood. My phone rang as I reached my car. It was Dr. Martinez calling about a new case. Another elderly victim, another family torn apart by greed, another chance to help someone recover what had been stolen from them. "Are you free to meet with a new client tomorrow?" she asked. Elderly gentleman whose stepchildren seemed to have helped him reorganize his assets. "Sound familiar?" "I'll be there," I said without hesitation. As I drove away from the courthouse, I thought about that family photo from Brianna's wedding, the one where they'd excluded me so casually, so cruelly. At the time, it had felt like the end of everything I'd believed about love and loyalty and family bonds. Now I understood it differently. That photo had been the beginning of my real life, the life where I chose my own family, where I built something meaningful from the ashes of betrayal, where I honored my grandmother's memory by protecting other people's grandmothers from the same fate. They'd tried to erase me from their story, but instead I'd written my own. So here's my question for all of you amazing viewers who've stuck with me through this incredible journey. Have you ever had to choose between family loyalty and doing what's right? Have you discovered that sometimes the family you choose is stronger than the family you're born with? I want to hear your stories in the comments below, because I've learned that we're not alone in these experiences. Please hit that like button if this story resonated with you. Subscribe for more real life stories about finding strength in the hardest moments, and share this with anyone who needs to hear that they deserve better than family members who don't treat them like family. Thank you all for being part of my chosen family here in this community, and remember, sometimes the greatest act of love for yourself is refusing to accept less than you deserve. Until next time, keep choosing the people who choose you back.